I was just a kid when my parents decided to kick me out at 18, also they could shower their golden child with everything she desired. They believed that men had it easier, and I made sure they felt the consequences of their choices when they needed me most. Now, at 26, I look back and realize how predictable it all was. There were signs everywhere, but I was too young to see them. My parents were the type who preached that struggle builds character, but only when it was someone else's struggle. They loved to boast about how they worked hard for everything they had, conveniently forgetting that my grandparents had helped them with a down payment on their house and provided free childcare. When it was my turn, however, tough love was the mantra. My sister, Lily, received everything on a silver platter: a car for her sweet 16, full college tuition, and a plush apartment after graduation. I came home from my shift at the grocery store on my 18th birthday, expecting the usual half-hearted happy birthday from my mom and a nod from my dad. Instead, I found my belongings packed in garbage bags on the porch. My parents stood in the doorway like bouncers at a club I wasn't allowed to enter. Mom's exact words were, "You're an adult now, time to act like one." Dad didn't even look me in the eye. "It'll build character," he added, as if he were doing me a favor. They told me they had to make their own way at my age, a blatant lie. I had been working and paying my own expenses for 2 years already. They offered me nothing, no money, no chance to stay until I found a place, not even a meal, just a bag of clothes, my phone, and a hollow good luck. I stood there in shock, but they were done with me. The door shut, the locks clicked, and that was it. I had nowhere to go. My first thought was to call my aunt, but when I did, she sighed as if I were an inconvenience and said, "You know how your parents are, they just want you to learn." My uncle laughed and told me to figure it out. Every relative I reached out to either ignored me or fed me the same line about how my parents were teaching me responsibility. I ended up in my car, with about $200 to my name and no plan. I parked in the back of a Walmart lot at night, cracked the window open, and tried to sleep. The first week, I kept thinking this was temporary, that any second my dad would call and say they'd changed their minds, that they were just testing me. That call never came. The money ran out quickly, gas was cheap, fast food was a luxury, and occasional showers at the gym became my routine. Every dollar vanished. I learned which gas stations had the cleanest bathrooms, how to make a single meal last an entire day, and that when people saw a young guy sleeping in a car, they either pitied me or pretended I didn't exist. I applied everywhere: grocery stores, fast food, retail, but nothing stuck. I wasn't the only desperate person looking for work, and without a permanent address, I was even lower on the list. The worst part wasn't the hunger or exhaustion, it was the knowledge that I had parents, family, a home, but none of it was mine anymore. Meanwhile, my sister was posting pictures from her semester abroad, funded by our parents. A month later, I finally caught a break. A diner downtown needed a dishwasher. It was minimum wage, barely enough to survive, but it was something. The manager, an older man named Frank, didn't ask too many questions. He let me take extra shifts, paid me under the table at first, and turned a blind eye when I used the employee bathroom to clean up. I worked until my hands bled, showered at the gym, and saved every dollar. Slowly, I crawled out of the hole. I missed my high school graduation because I couldn't afford to take time off work, not that my parents cared. They made it clear I wasn't their problem. I heard through a friend that my name was called, but my seat was empty. That stung more than I expected. The worst moment came later. I had saved enough to rent a tiny room in a shared house, thanks to a coworker who introduced me to a friend renting cheap. I had a bed again, a door that locked, a place to breathe. It wasn't much, but after months of sleeping in my car, it felt like a mansion. One night, I got curious and called my parents, not because I wanted to make amends, but to see if they regretted their decision. The call went straight to voicemail. When I tried again, I realized they had blocked me. I stared at my phone, unsure whether to laugh or throw it. I responded to my father's email with a short, polite reply, asking how they had been. The response came quickly, and while they claimed to be doing okay, there were vague hints that things had been rough. My father's wording was careful, as if he were trying to reel me in without scaring me off. That told me everything I needed to know. I didn't ask questions right away. Instead, I let the conversation stretch out, keeping it light and letting them believe I was genuinely happy to reconnect. Over the next week, we exchanged a few emails. My father kept steering the conversation toward the past, reminiscing about how they thought of me often and how they wished things had been different. Not once did he mention why things were the way they were. Then came the real reason for their outreach. He finally admitted that they were struggling financially. The business my mother had owned for years had collapsed, bad investments, poor decisions, a little too much arrogance. Whatever the cause, it was gone, and without it, they were drowning in debt. Still, he didn't ask for anything, not yet. He was just laying the groundwork, waiting for me to offer. A few days later, my mother called. Her number had been blocked for years, so they must have gotten a new one. The moment I answered, I knew something was different. Gone was the woman who had called me useless and said I'd never make it. She sounded warm and friendly, asking about my life, my job, how things were going for me. The same woman who had blocked me for existing was suddenly the doting mother. I played my part, telling her I was doing well, that work was steady. I kept the details vague, but I could hear it in her voice, the realization that I wasn't struggling, that I was actually successful. That's when it really hit her. I had a good-paying career, I had money, and they needed money. It didn't take long for my father to call again, slipping it into conversation about the house, the mortgage, the unpaid bills my mother had miscalculated. They were months behind, and if they didn't come up with the money soon, they would lose everything. There was no question in his voice, no asking, just an assumption that, of course, I would step in. That I, the son they discarded without a second thought, would swoop in and save them. I let the silence stretch, then told him I'd think about it. I could almost hear the relief in his voice. That was enough for them. They latched onto it like it was a lifeline. Over the next few weeks, I let them believe they had a chance. I visited for the first time in years, sitting in the same living room where they had once locked me out, letting them feed me their story piece by piece. I asked about their finances, pretending I wanted to understand the full picture. They spilled everything, mortgage payments behind by months, credit card debt stacked high, my mother's business loans in default. They were running out of time, and they had no one else to turn to. The more they saw of me, the more they realized how much they had underestimated me. My car wasn't brand new, but it was nice. My clothes weren't designer, but they were high quality. I wasn't barely scraping by, I was thriving. That's when the guilt trip started. My father began talking about family, how hard it was for them to reach out, how he regretted the past but knew we could move forward. My mother, once too proud to admit failure, now sat in front of me talking about second chances. I nodded, listened, pretended to care, and told them I needed more time. One night while I was visiting, I noticed a folder on the kitchen table: overdue bills, credit card statements, a foreclosure notice stamped in red. That's when I knew they were completely screwed. No safety net, no backup plan. If I didn't help them, no one would, and that was exactly what I wanted. I left that night with a smile on my face, telling them I'd figure things out and see what I could do. They thanked me as if I had already handed them a check. They had no idea that this time, I was the one in control. 2 weeks passed, and my parents grew more desperate. At first, they played it cool, dropping casual mentions of their tight situation, hoping I'd jump in with an offer. When I didn't, the messages became more frequent, and then the calls started. My father's voice carried a forced lightness, but the cracks were showing. My mother barely spoke, the silence from her said more than words ever could. I let them wait. Every time they brought up the mortgage, I told them I was thinking about it, that I needed to figure things out. Each delay sent them spiraling further. Flipping through the papers, I took mental notes. The mortgage was months behind, and the auction date was already set. If they didn't pay soon, the bank would take the house. The credit cards were maxed out, and my mother's name was attached to a failed business loan that had completely tanked. There was no saving them. They had burned every bridge, spent every last favor, and they had no idea I wasn't going to help. My mother, once too proud to even look at me, sat across the table with her hands folded, her leg bouncing under the table, a nervous tic I'd never seen before. For years, this was the woman who told me to figure it out, who threw me out without a second thought. Now, she was practically begging. "We never wanted this," she muttered. We thought we were doing what was best for you. I leaned back, letting the silence stretch. Did you ever regret it? I asked. The silence lingered too long. That's not the point now, my father cut in. We just need to move forward. That was all the confirmation I needed. I finally gave them what they were waiting for. I told them I would help, but only under strict conditions. I played it carefully, making it seem like I was doing this for their own good. I can't just hand over the money, I said. It needs to be structured, secure. I talked about financial responsibility, learning from mistakes, and how this was the only way to keep their house. They nodded along, clinging to every word. Desperate people don't ask questions, they just say yes. So when I pulled out a contract, they barely skimmed it before signing. I had already spoken to a lawyer. The contract transferred the house deed to me. It was official. It was written in a way that made it seem temporary, like I was just holding it as loan security, but in reality, once they signed, they no longer owned their own home. They signed without hesitation. My father even thanked me, and my mother shook my hand. They thanked me as if I had done them a favor. They truly believed they had won. The moment I had the signed papers, I started moving. I contacted real estate agents and quietly prepared to flip the house. It was still valuable, even with their financial mess attached to it. All I had to do was wait for their deadline. Then it came. They called, expecting the money. I told them there was a problem, that I couldn't come through with the payments after all. I expressed my sorrow, saying the bank was moving forward with a foreclosure. But of course, it wasn't their house anymore, it was mine. The knock on their door came the next morning, our official eviction papers. The moment they opened them, I watched the blood drain from my father's face. My mother actually stumbled back, gripping the counter. They read the documents over and over, flipping through the pages as if the words would change. They didn't. I stood there, calm, just watching. We have nowhere to go, my father's voice cracked. We trusted you. I shrugged. So did I. My father collapsed onto the couch, sobbing. My mother, who had spent years calling me weak, had no words left, just silence. They begged, offered to work something out, pleaded for anything. I reminded them of the day they locked me out at 18, no warning, no support, just a garbage bag of my things on the porch and a locked door. Then I repeated exactly what my mother had said to me that day, "You're an adult now, time to be one." And I walked out. The eviction wasn't just a private humiliation, it was public. Word spread fast. Their friends, neighbors, even distant family members all found out. My parents tried to spin the story, claiming it was some kind of misunderstanding, but the truth always finds a way out. They turned to relatives, hoping someone would step in, but the response was underwhelming. Everyone they contacted already knew how they had treated me. The same family members who once told them that kicking me out was teaching me responsibility now had nothing to offer them. Some ignored their calls entirely, others just told them, "You made your bed." They had spent years burning bridges, and now, when they needed one the most, they found themselves stranded with no help coming. They had to downsize fast. Their once proud home was gone, and now they were crammed into a tiny, rundown apartment, the kind of place where the walls were thin, the neighbors were loud, and the smell of cheap cleaning products never quite masked the scent of old cigarette smoke. It was a far cry from the house they used to own, the house that was now mine. They weren't adjusting well. The complaints started almost immediately. The proud woman who used to carry herself with an air of untouchability now moved like a shadow of her former self. Then came the hospital visits. At first, they were minor checkups and tests, but soon it got worse. Her blood pressure was through the roof, and she had trouble breathing. Doctors warned her to take it easy, but taking it easy wasn't an option when there was no money left. The hospital bills piled up fast, too fast. Without proper insurance, they had to choose what to pay, rent or medical bills, groceries or medication. Nothing was enough. That's when my father reached out again. The first message was casual, a simple, "Hey, can we talk?" I ignored it. Then the call started, first once a day, then multiple times, followed by a voicemail. His voice cracked with desperation. I finally listened. He needed help, not the kind where he wanted advice or emotional support, he needed money. Just a little, just enough to get through the month. I knew what was coming when I finally answered. He launched into a speech he had probably rehearsed 100 times. My mother was sick, they were struggling, the apartment was too expensive, they just needed a little help. I told him I could help, then I Venmo'd him exactly $100, the same amount he had thrown at me the day he kicked me out. His response was instant, another call, another voicemail, this time filled with rage. He accused me of being heartless, of being cruel, of abandoning my own parents. But he didn't say anything about when they abandoned me. I didn't respond. I didn't think about them after that. I had my own life, my own home, my own peace. For the first time in years, I felt free. With the money I had made from selling their old house, I upgraded and bought a place far away, a house that was mine and mine alone. No ghosts of the past, no bad memories, just a fresh start. Months passed, then a year. I never heard from them again, not directly, at least. But people talk. A childhood friend reached out, not realizing we weren't in contact. She mentioned my parents in passing, talking about how badly things had gone for them. They lost everything, she said. They've been moving from place to place. No one wants to take them in. I just nodded, not offering anything in return. One day, I drove by the house that used to be mine. New owners had moved in. The yard looked better, the paint was fresh, it looked like a home again. I didn't stop, I didn't feel the need to. That chapter of my life was closed. I had no regrets, no guilt, just peace. They had made their choices, and now they had to live with them, just like I had to. 3 months after the eviction, things had been silent. I figured my parents had finally given up, that they had found some way to survive without me. Then one evening, a message popped up in my inbox. It was from my father. There was no manipulation this time, no guilt-tripping, just pure desperation. He said they had lost everything, that they had tried but it was impossible, that he had no one left to turn to. He begged, not for money, not for help with bills, but for a place to stay. For the first time, he didn't pretend to be strong. For the first time, he admitted they had nowhere else to go. He mentioned my mother's health had gotten worse, that she was too weak to work, that hospital bills had piled up faster than they could handle. She had stopped eating properly, stopped taking her medication. The stress had destroyed her. But even in the email, it was clear he wasn't asking for help because he regretted what they had done to me, he was asking because they had no other choice. On top of everything else, my mother had lost her job, too many missed shifts, too much stress, too many things piling up at once. With no income from either of them, they had no way to survive. They were drowning, and every attempt to grab onto something just pulled them down further. They had downgraded again. The tiny apartment they had barely been able to afford was gone. Now they were somewhere worse, a rundown one-bedroom in a bad part of town, the kind of place with roaches in the walls and broken locks on the doors. They had gone from homeowners to homeless in a matter of months, and now they were reaching out to the son they abandoned for a lifeline. The same relatives who once praised them for teaching me responsibility had turned their backs on them. They had asked for help, but no one offered. People remembered what they had done. Some ignored them, some told them, "You made your bed, now lie in it." There was no sympathy left. My father's final plea was survive the next day, how I had to beg for shifts just to afford food, how I had missed my own graduation because I wasn't even allowed in my own home. I reminded him that when I reached out for help, they blocked my number. I asked him if he ever cared about what happened to me. He had no answer. He tried to justify it, saying they thought I had it under control, that they wanted to teach me resilience. They didn't think it would be that bad, they thought I would be fine. I reminded him of the words he threw at me when he locked the door behind me at 18, that I was an adult now, that I had to figure it out, that struggling builds character. I told him he should use that same resilience now. He sobbed harder, but I didn't waver. He realized I wasn't going to change my mind, there were no more second chances. He hung up in defeat. That was the last time we ever spoke. My mother never reached out, not once. Maybe pride stopped her, maybe shame did, or maybe she just knew it wouldn't change anything. That night, I blocked the number, blocked the email, blocked everything. There would be no more messages, no more last chances, no more ghosts from the past. There was no lingering resentment, no anger, no sadness, just peace. They were finally gone, and for the first time in my life, I was truly free. 5 months passed without a word from my father. I figured he had finally given up, that he had learned to survive the way he expected me to. Then one afternoon, he showed up at my workplace. The front desk receptionist called me, her voice hesitant, saying there was a man outside asking for me. He looked rough, disheveled clothes, messy hair, eyes red like he'd been crying for hours. He had no appointment, no reason to be there, just desperation written all over his face. The security cameras outside the building showed him pacing, checking his phone, wiping his face. He looked like someone who had nothing left. He waited, he wasn't leaving without talking to me. He started causing a disturbance when the receptionist refused to calm me down immediately. His voice rose, attracting attention. A few co-workers gathered near the windows, whispering. No one knew who he was, but they could tell it wasn't good. It didn't take long before someone came to get me. One of my colleagues walked into my office looking uneasy. There's a man outside, they said. He's asking for you. It's not subtle. I already knew who it was. I could have ignored him, let security handle it, but instead, I walked downstairs. I stepped outside and saw him immediately. He froze when he saw me. For a moment, he just stared, like he didn't recognize me, or maybe he did, but he hadn't expected this version of me, the one who had built a life without him. Then he burst into tears. He started talking fast, words tumbling over each other, how much he missed me, how he had made mistakes, how he was struggling and didn't know what else to do. He stood there crying in the middle of my workplace parking lot, pouring out regrets he had never spoken before. But even now, he never fully owned it. He said things could have been different, that he wasn't in the right place back then, that he didn't know what he was doing. But he never actually apologized for throwing me out, never admitted how he ruined my life before it even started. He just cried, repeating how much he needed me now. Then came the real reason he was there. He had nowhere to go. He had lost everything, no savings, no home, no one left to help him. He begged for a place to stay, just for a little while, just until he could get back on his feet. He looked at me like he was sure I would say yes, like I was still the child he had once controlled. I didn't yell, didn't argue, didn't waste time. I just looked him in the eye and repeated the exact words he told me when he kicked me out at 18, "You're an adult, you'll figure it out." He blinked, and for the first time, he understood. He never expected me to be indifferent, not like this, not after everything. He had built up this version of me in his head, one where I was still desperate for his approval, still craving a family that had never truly existed. That version of me was dead. He collapsed to the ground, not physically, but emotionally, wailing, pleading, clutching at my arm like he could make me change my mind. I turned my back and walked away. He didn't stop, he kept crying, kept begging, even as I walked back into the building. The receptionist was already on the phone.